In the winter of 1856, in the remote wilderness outside Joplin, Missouri, the Blackwood family estate became the site of the most horrifying discovery ever documented in the American frontier. Sheriff Cornelius Whitfield, a veteran lawman who had witnessed the brutalities of westward expansion, filled 8 evidence ledgers with testimonies and observations that challenged every understanding of maternal instinct known to civilized society. Eleanor Blackwood appeared to be the model of frontier motherhood, a devoted matriarch who had opened her heart and home to countless abandoned children. But beneath her weathered barn lay a collection of small graves that would reveal a darkness so profound it defied explanation. For nearly a decade, 23 children had vanished from settlements across 4 counties, their disappearances attributed to the harsh realities of frontier life: wolf attacks, drowning accidents, diseases that claimed the young without warning. But the truth about Eleanor Blackwood would expose a systematic horror that challenged everything Missouri Territory thought it knew about the sacred bond between a mother and her children. Before we delve deeper into the nightmare that was uncovered beneath Eleanor Blackwood's barn, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into America's darkest historical mysteries. And please, let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts around the world. The events that would make the name Eleanor Blackwood synonymous with terror began not with violence, but with what appeared to be extraordinary maternal compassion. The Missouri Territory of 1856 was a land where survival demanded fierce independence. Yet even the hardiest pioneers recognized that some burdens were too great for any family to bear alone. Children orphaned by disease, accident, or the countless dangers of frontier life were a tragic but common sight in the scattered settlements that dotted the wilderness. The Blackwood homestead occupied a secluded valley 18 miles southwest of Joplin, Missouri, nestled between rolling hills covered in dense stands of oak, maple, and pine. Eleanor Blackwood had established her claim to the land in 1846, a year after the death of her husband Marcus in a logging accident that left her widowed at 32 with 3 young children to raise alone. What followed was one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of the Missouri frontier. Eleanor Blackwood was a woman of imposing presence, standing nearly 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of hard physical labor. Her steel-gray hair was always pulled back in a severe bun, and her pale blue eyes held an intensity that could make grown men uncomfortable. Yet when she spoke of children, her voice took on a gentleness that seemed to transform her entire demeanor. She had, according to every account from those who knew her, devoted her life to caring for the unfortunate young ones that fate had left without families. Her own 3 children, Martha, aged 28 in 1856, Benjamin, 26, and Sarah, 24, had grown into capable adults who seemed to share their mother's dedication to charitable work. Martha possessed her mother's imposing height and strength, serving as the primary disciplinarian for the younger children in Eleanor's care. Benjamin managed the practical aspects of the homestead: farming, livestock, and the construction of additional buildings needed to house their growing family. Sarah, the youngest, had inherited Eleanor's gift for working with troubled children, displaying remarkable patience and skill in helping new arrivals adjust to life at the Blackwood homestead. What made Eleanor Blackwood extraordinary, at least in the eyes of her contemporaries, was her seemingly unlimited capacity for taking in orphaned and abandoned children. Word of her generosity had spread throughout the region, and local church leaders, county officials, and desperate families regularly brought children to her door. Unlike most frontier families who could barely feed their own offspring, Eleanor never turned away a child in need. Reverend Jonathan Hayes of the Joplin Methodist Church had been instrumental in connecting Eleanor with many of the children who came into her care. A meticulous record keeper, Hayes maintained detailed logs of every child placement he arranged, and his journals would later prove crucial to investigators trying to understand the scope of Eleanor's activities. "Mrs. Blackwood was a godsend to our community," Reverend Hayes would tell Sheriff Whitfield during the investigation. "I personally arranged for no fewer than 19 children to be placed in her care over the years. She never asked for compensation, never complained about the burden. She would simply listen to the circumstances, nod her understanding, and ask when the child could be brought to her home." Dr. Nathaniel Garrison, the circuit physician who served the scattered communities around Joplin, had made regular visits to the Blackwood homestead and had been consistently impressed by what he observed. His medical journal, discovered after his death in 1859, contained detailed observations that painted a picture of a model charitable institution. "The Blackwood homestead represents the finest example of Christian charity I have encountered on the frontier," Dr. Garrison wrote in an entry dated September 1854. "Mrs. Blackwood has transformed her property into what amounts to a private orphanage, housing upwards of 20 children at any given time. The facilities are clean and well-maintained, the children appear adequately nourished, and the level of organization required to manage such a large household is truly remarkable."
Dr. Garrison's observations were supported by numerous other community members who had occasion to visit the Blackwood property. Thomas Aldrich, a traveling merchant who made regular stops at frontier homesteads, consistently praised Eleanor's management of her unusual household. "I've been trading goods throughout Missouri Territory for 15 years, Aldrich told investigators, "and I can honestly say I never encountered a more efficiently run operation than Eleanor Blackwood's place. The children were always clean, clothed, and well-behaved. They worked together like a precision machine, some tending crops, others managing livestock, the older ones helping with younger children. It was like watching a small town function under the guidance of a truly gifted leader." What impressed visitors most was Eleanor's apparent understanding of child psychology and development. She had developed what seemed to be revolutionary methods for helping traumatized orphans overcome their grief and integrate into productive family life. Children who arrived at her homestead broken by loss and abandonment would, within months, become model young citizens who worked diligently and seemed genuinely happy. Margaret Thornton, wife of a local judge, had been particularly impressed by Eleanor's success with difficult cases. She would take children that other families couldn't handle, youngsters who had been made wild by trauma or neglect, and somehow transform them into the most polite, industrious little people you could imagine. I often asked her secret, and she would simply smile and say the children needed firm but loving guidance to reach their potential. Eleanor's methods appeared to center around creating a highly structured environment where every child had specific responsibilities and clear expectations. New arrivals were paired with older children who served as mentors and guides, helping them learn the routines and rules that governed life at the homestead. Eleanor herself maintained overall authority, but delegated much of the day-to-day management to her adult children and the older orphans who had been with the family longest. The physical layout of the Blackwood property reflected Eleanor's systematic approach to childcare. The original homestead had been expanded over the years to include multiple dormitory-style buildings, each housing children of similar ages. A large communal kitchen could prepare meals for 30 or more people, while a schoolhouse allowed Eleanor to provide basic education to all children in her care. Workshop buildings housed various crafts and trades that the children could learn as they prepared for adult life. Visitors consistently noted the remarkable discipline and cooperation displayed by the Blackwood children. Unlike typical frontier youngsters who might be expected to exhibit some wildness or rebelliousness, Eleanor's charges moved through their daily routines with military-like precision. They spoke respectfully to adults, completed their assigned tasks without complaint, and showed genuine concern for each other's welfare. James Morrison, a county official who had conducted annual inspections of the Blackwood homestead as part of his duties overseeing child welfare, had nothing but praise for Eleanor's operation. Mrs. Blackwood has created something truly special, Morrison wrote in his official reports. She has taken the most disadvantaged children from across the region and given them not just shelter and sustenance, but genuine opportunity for productive futures. Many of these youngsters would have died without her intervention, and those who survived would likely have grown up to be burdens on society. Instead, she has transformed them into capable, moral young people. What county officials didn't realize was that Morrison's annual inspections had been carefully orchestrated events. Eleanor would receive advance notice of inspection dates, allowing her to prepare the homestead and the children for official scrutiny. Only the most presentable children would be visible during these visits, while others would be kept busy with tasks in distant fields or buildings. The children selected for interaction with officials had been specifically trained in appropriate responses to questions about their treatment and living conditions. Eleanor's reputation extended far beyond her immediate community. Stories of her charitable work had reached territorial authorities in Jefferson City, and she had received official commendation from Governor Sterling Price for her contributions to child welfare. Newspaper articles in St. Louis and Kansas City had featured her as an example of frontier virtue, describing her homestead as a beacon of hope for the territory's most vulnerable children. The success of Eleanor's operation had also attracted attention from religious organizations throughout the region. The Methodist Church had provided financial support for expansion of her facilities, while various women's charitable societies had donated clothing, educational materials, and medical supplies. Eleanor had become something of a celebrity in charitable circles, invited to speak at church gatherings and community events about her methods and philosophy. But beneath the veneer of Christian charity and community recognition, a far darker reality had been developing at the Blackwood homestead. Eleanor Blackwood was not the saintly mother figure she appeared to be, but rather a calculating predator who had discovered that society's blind spots regarding children provided perfect cover for systematic exploitation and abuse.
The children in Eleanor's care were not the fortunate beneficiaries of maternal love, but rather victims of a sophisticated system of psychological and physical control that had been refined over nearly a decade. Eleanor had learned to identify the types of children who would be missed least. True orphans with no remaining family connections, children from desperately poor families who saw placement as their only option, and youngsters whose behavioral problems had made them unwelcome elsewhere. Eleanor's selection process was methodical and ruthless. She would carefully research each child's background, ensuring that they had no relatives or community connections who might inquire about their welfare after placement. Children with living family members were generally refused, while those who were completely alone in the world were eagerly accepted. Eleanor had developed relationships with officials throughout the region who would alert her to newly orphaned children before other families had opportunity to offer them homes. Once children arrived at the Blackwood homestead, they entered a carefully controlled environment designed to break down their individual identity and reshape them into compliant servants. New arrivals underwent what Eleanor called orientation, a process that involved isolation, careful observation, and systematic testing to determine their psychological vulnerabilities and potential usefulness. Children who showed signs of strong will or independence were subjected to increasingly harsh treatment until their resistance was broken. Those who adapted quickly to the homestead's demands were rewarded with better food, clothing, and living conditions. Over time, Eleanor had created a hierarchy among the children that encouraged them to police each other's behavior and report any signs of rebellion or escape planning. The physical layout of the homestead, so impressive to visitors, actually served to facilitate Eleanor's control over the children. The dormitory buildings were constructed with locks on the outside, allowing troublesome children to be confined when necessary. The workshop buildings contained not just legitimate crafts and trades,
but also areas where children could be subjected to physical punishment away from the sight of potential visitors. Eleanor's adult children were not innocent participants in the homestead's activities, but rather willing accomplices who had been raised from childhood to view the exploitation of vulnerable children as normal and necessary. Martha Blackwood had become skilled at identifying and manipulating the psychological weaknesses of new arrivals, using a combination of false kindness and calculated cruelty to break down their resistance. Benjamin Blackwood managed the practical aspects of concealing the homestead's true nature, including the construction of hidden areas and the disposal of evidence. Sarah Blackwood had developed expertise in medical matters, allowing her to treat injuries inflicted during punishment while ensuring that no visible evidence remained when officials visited. The true horror of the Blackwood homestead lay not just in the systematic abuse of children, but in Eleanor's gradual escalation toward murder. Over the years, she had developed an increasingly callous attitude toward the lives of the children in her care, viewing them as expendable resources to be used until they were no longer useful. Children who became too old to be easily controlled, who developed health problems that made them burdensome, or who showed signs of potentially exposing the homestead's secrets, began disappearing from the property. Eleanor had developed sophisticated methods for explaining these disappearances to community members who might inquire about specific children. Some were said to have been apprenticed to families in distant settlements. Others claimed to have run away despite the homestead's benevolent environment, and still others were reported to have died from illnesses or accidents common to frontier life. Eleanor's reputation for honesty and charitable work made these explanations readily accepted by community members who had no reason to suspect deception. The burial ground beneath the barn had begun as a practical solution to the problem of disposing of bodies without attracting attention. Eleanor had chosen the location carefully, knowing that the barn's foundation would prevent casual discovery, while the building's regular use would discourage closer examination. Over time, the burial site had expanded to accommodate the growing number of children who had died under Eleanor's care, creating a hidden cemetery that would eventually hold the remains of 23 young victims. Dr. Garrison's praise for the cleanliness and organization of the Blackwood homestead had been more accurate than he realized. Eleanor maintained meticulous records of every aspect of her operation, including detailed documentation of the children who had died and been buried on the property. These records, hidden in secret compartments throughout the homestead, would eventually provide investigators with a comprehensive understanding of the scope and systematic nature of Eleanor's crimes. The financial aspects of Eleanor's operation revealed another layer of her calculated approach to child exploitation. While she accepted no payment for taking in children, she had developed numerous methods for profiting from their labor. Children old enough to work were hired out to neighboring farms during harvest seasons, with Eleanor keeping the wages. Crafts produced in the homestead workshops were sold at markets throughout the region, generating substantial income that Eleanor claimed was needed to support her charitable activities.
Eleanor had also learned to exploit the sympathies of charitable organizations and community members, regularly soliciting donations of money, food, clothing, and supplies for her operation. The homestead's reputation for efficiency and good management made it a popular recipient of charitable giving, providing Eleanor with resources far beyond what would be needed to simply house and feed the children in her care. The seasonal patterns of life on the frontier provided Eleanor with natural cover for her activities. During harsh winters, it was common for homesteads to have minimal contact with neighbors, making it easy to conceal problems or changes in household composition. Spring planting and fall harvest seasons brought increased activity that could mask unusual sounds or activities around the property. Summer months, when travel was easiest, were when Eleanor would orchestrate carefully planned visits from officials and community members, ensuring that the homestead presented its most favorable appearance. Eleanor's understanding of frontier psychology had also contributed to her success in maintaining her facade. Frontier communities were characterized by strong traditions of self-reliance and non-interference in family matters. Neighbors might notice unusual activities at the Blackwood homestead, but cultural norms discouraged them from asking questions or expressing concerns. Eleanor exploited these social conventions to maintain privacy for activities that would have been immediately recognized as suspicious in more urban environments. The discovery that would finally expose Eleanor Blackwood's crimes began on a bitter December morning in 1856, when a series of severe storms brought winds strong enough to damage buildings throughout the region. The Blackwood barn, which had stood for nearly a decade, finally succumbed to the relentless weather, revealing secrets that had been hidden beneath its foundation since the earliest days of Eleanor's charitable work. The storm that struck the Joplin region in December 1856 would later be remembered as one of the most destructive weather events in Missouri Territory history. Winds exceeding 60 miles per hour toppled trees that had stood for decades, destroyed barns and outbuildings across 3 counties, and claimed the lives of 7 people caught in the open during the worst of the tempest. But for Sheriff Cornelius Whitfield, the storm's most significant impact was the partial collapse of Eleanor Blackwood's barn, which exposed secrets that had been hidden beneath its foundation for nearly a decade. The discovery began at dawn on December 15th when Benjamin Blackwood arrived at Sheriff Whitfield's office in Joplin, his clothes torn and his face pale with what appeared to be genuine distress. Benjamin had ridden through the night from the family homestead, he explained, after discovering damage to the barn that revealed something deeply troubling beneath the building's foundation. "Sheriff Whitfield," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious agitation, "we need you to come to our property immediately. The storm knocked down part of Mother's barn, and we found what looks like graves underneath, small graves. We don't understand what they are or how they got there." Sheriff Whitfield had known the Blackwood family for years and had nothing but respect for Eleanor's charitable work. The idea that there might be hidden graves on her property seemed impossible, but Benjamin's distress appeared genuine, and the request for immediate official investigation suggested transparency rather than deception. Whitfield assembled a small investigative party consisting of himself, Deputy Marshal Frank Garrison, Dr. Nathaniel Garrison's younger brother, and County Coroner William Hayes, Reverend Jonathan Hayes's brother-in-law. The men rode through the storm-damaged countryside to the Blackwood homestead, arriving in mid-afternoon to find the family gathered around the collapsed section of barn in apparent bewilderment. Eleanor Blackwood stood amid the wreckage with her characteristic composure, directing the cleanup efforts while comforting several of the younger children who seemed frightened by the destruction. She greeted Sheriff Whitfield with her usual dignified manner, explaining that the family had been fortunate that no one was injured when the barn partially collapsed during the night. "We've been so blessed over the years, Sheriff," she said, gesturing toward the children who surrounded her. "The good Lord has watched over our family and all these precious children. But this morning's discovery has us deeply troubled. We simply cannot understand what these things are beneath our barn." The collapsed section of the barn had revealed a carefully excavated area beneath the building's foundation. Even from a distance, Sheriff Whitfield could see what appeared to be deliberately arranged stones marking rectangular areas in the earth. As he approached for closer examination, the true horror of the discovery became apparent. Beneath the barn's foundation lay a systematic burial ground containing the remains of at least 20 individuals, all appearing to be children based on the size of the graves and the small bones visible where the earth had been disturbed. The graves were arranged in neat rows, marked with carefully placed stones, and showed evidence of deliberate excavation and burial, rather than random disposal of remains. Coroner Hayes began the grim task of preliminary examination, while Sheriff Whitfield documented the scene and Deputy Marshal Frank Garrison questioned the Blackwood family.
"Sheriff, I am as horrified by this discovery as you are," Eleanor told Whitfield, her voice carrying just the right note of maternal concern and Christian indignation. "The thought that such a thing could exist on our property, so close to where our dear children sleep each night, is beyond comprehension. We must get to the bottom of this immediately." Dr. Nathaniel Garrison arrived at the scene that evening, summoned by his brother to assist with the medical examination of the remains. His preliminary assessment confirmed Sheriff Whitfield's worst fears. The burial ground contained the remains of approximately 23 children, ranging in age from perhaps 5 to 15 years old. The condition of the bones suggested the deaths had occurred over a period of several years, with some remains showing evidence of deliberate burial, while others appeared to have been disposed of more hastily. Dr. Garrison's medical training allowed him to make observations that would prove crucial to the investigation. Several of the skeletons showed evidence of trauma that suggested violent death rather than natural causes. Fractured skulls, broken ribs, and damaged limb bones indicated that at least some of the children had died from physical violence rather than disease or accident. "These injuries are consistent with deliberate assault rather than accidental trauma," Dr. Garrison reported to Sheriff Whitfield. "The pattern of bone damage suggests systematic abuse over extended periods, followed by violent death. This is not the result of epidemic disease or natural disaster." Eleanor Blackwood's reaction to Dr. Garrison's findings appeared to be one of genuine shock and horror. She insisted on being present during the examination, claiming that, as someone who had devoted her life to protecting children, she needed to understand what had happened to these young victims. Her questions to Dr. Garrison seemed motivated by maternal concern rather than guilty knowledge. "Doctor, is it possible to determine how long ago these poor children died?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "If we can establish a timeline, perhaps we can determine who was responsible for this atrocity. The thought that someone could do such things to innocent children makes my heart break." The investigation expanded over the following days, as Sheriff Whitfield began the complex process of attempting to identify the remains and determine their connection to the Blackwood property. County records showed that Eleanor had purchased the land in 1846, suggesting that if she was involved in the deaths, the murders had occurred over a period of at least 10 years. Whitfield's initial approach focused on missing children from the region, attempting to match disappearances with the timeline suggested by the burial ground. What he discovered was a disturbing pattern of child disappearances that stretched across 4 counties and spanned nearly a decade. The first documented disappearance that might be connected to the burial ground was that of 8-year-old Michael Thornton, who had vanished from his family's homestead 30 miles south of Joplin in the spring of 1847. Michael had been playing near his family's cabin when he disappeared without a trace, despite extensive searches by neighbors and local authorities. His parents had died in a cholera outbreak 6 months later, leaving no one to continue investigating his disappearance. Similar cases emerged as Whitfield expanded his research. 7-year-old Rebecca Morrison had disappeared from her grandmother's farm in 1848, last seen walking toward a creek where she often gathered wildflowers. 10-year-old Samuel Fletcher had vanished from a church gathering in 1849, apparently wandering off during a community meal and never returning. In each case, the missing children were from families with limited resources or social connections, making them unlikely to attract sustained attention from authorities. Deputy Marshal Garrison's investigation of county welfare records revealed another disturbing pattern. Many of the missing children had been subjects of discussions about potential placement with families willing to provide care. In several cases,
Eleanor Blackwood's name appeared in official correspondence as someone who might be willing to take in additional children, though formal placement records could not be located. Mrs. Blackwood's reputation for charitable work made her a natural person for officials to contact when seeking homes for orphaned or abandoned children, but the official paperwork for many of these placements seems to be incomplete or missing entirely. It's possible that children were placed with her through informal arrangements that weren't properly documented. Eleanor's response to these revelations continued to appear appropriate for someone discovering that her property had been used for mass murder. She cooperated fully with the investigation, providing access to her personal records and encouraging officials to interview any of the children currently in her care. She seemed particularly concerned about the psychological impact the discovery might have on the children at the homestead. "These dear children have already suffered so much loss and trauma in their young lives. The knowledge that other children may have been murdered so close to their home could be devastating to their sense of security. I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to assist your investigation, but I hope we can minimize the distress to the innocent children who depend on our family for protection."
The interviews with children currently living at the Blackwood homestead initially supported Eleanor's claims of innocence. The children spoke positively about their treatment, describing Eleanor as a caring mother figure who provided them with food, shelter, education, and guidance. None of them reported witnessing violence or suspicious activities, and several expressed gratitude for the opportunity to live with the Blackwood family. However, Dr. Garrison noticed subtle inconsistencies in the children's accounts that suggested their responses might have been carefully coached. The children's descriptions of daily life at the homestead were remarkably similar, using nearly identical phrases to describe their experiences. When asked about former residents who had left the homestead, the children provided explanations that matched Eleanor's accounts almost word for word. The children speak as though they're reciting prepared answers rather than sharing personal memories, Dr. Garrison confided to Sheriff Whitfield. Their body language suggests fear or anxiety when discussing certain topics, even when their words express satisfaction with their treatment. I suspect they've been trained to provide specific responses to questions about their experiences. Sheriff Whitfield's investigation expanded to include interviews with community members who had interacted with the Blackwood family over the years. What emerged was a picture of a family that had maintained an impressive public facade while carefully controlling access to information about their private activities. Thomas Aldrich, the traveling merchant who had regularly traded with the Blackwood family, provided information that cast new light on Eleanor's operations. When pressed for details about his observations over the years, Aldrich recalled several incidents that had seemed unusual at the time but had been dismissed as minor eccentricities. "There were times when I'd arrive at the homestead expecting to see certain children who had been there during previous visits, only to be told they had moved on to other families or had been apprenticed elsewhere," Aldrich told investigators. "Mrs. Blackwood always had reasonable explanations, but now that I think about it, I never encountered any of these children at other homesteads during my travels. In a region where everyone knows everyone else's business, it seems strange that so many children could simply vanish without leaving any trace." Margaret Thornton, the judge's wife who had praised Eleanor's work with difficult children, revealed information that proved particularly troubling when examined in light of the burial ground discovery. Several of the children she had seen Eleanor transform from troubled to well-behaved had subsequently disappeared from the homestead under circumstances that now seemed suspicious. There was a boy named David, perhaps 12 years old, who had been placed with Mrs. Blackwood after his parents died in a house fire, Thornton recalled. "When I first met him, he was quite rebellious and difficult to manage. But Mrs. Blackwood worked her magic, and within months he had become a model child. The last time I visited the homestead, I asked about David, and Mrs. Blackwood explained that he had been apprenticed to a blacksmith in Kansas Territory.
At the time, I thought it wonderful that she had prepared him for such a good opportunity." County Coroner Hayes continued his examination of the remains, attempting to establish more precise timelines and causes of death for the buried children. His findings painted an increasingly disturbing picture of systematic violence that had escalated over time. The earliest burials show evidence of death from disease or malnutrition, Hayes reported to the investigation team. But the more recent remains demonstrate clear signs of violent trauma. This suggests a progression from neglect and abuse to deliberate murder, possibly indicating that the perpetrator became more comfortable with violence over time. Hayes also discovered evidence that some of the children had been subjected to prolonged torture before death. Bone damage consistent with repeated beatings, evidence of healing fractures that suggested ongoing abuse, and signs of deliberate mutilation indicated that the murders were not quick or merciful. Eleanor Blackwood's reaction to these findings appeared to be one of increasing horror and determination to see justice done. She began providing investigators with additional information about previous residents of the property, suggesting that perhaps one of the workers or temporary residents who had passed through over the years might have been responsible for the crimes. "Sheriff, I've been thinking about everyone who has lived on or worked at our property since we arrived. There have been several men who helped with construction projects or seasonal work who might have had opportunity to access the area beneath the barn. Perhaps one of them was responsible for these terrible crimes." Eleanor's suggestions led investigators to track down several men who had worked at the Blackwood homestead over the years. However, none of these individuals proved to have knowledge of the burial ground, and several provided alibis that eliminated them as suspects for some of the murders based on Hayes's timeline. Dr. Garrison's continued examination of the remains revealed additional disturbing details. Several of the skeletons showed evidence of medical experimentation, including crude surgical procedures and evidence of deliberate bone breaking and healing. The pattern suggested that someone with medical knowledge was using the children as subjects for studying anatomy and surgical techniques.
These injuries are consistent with someone conducting medical experiments on living subjects, Dr. Garrison reported confidentially to Sheriff Whitfield. The precision of some of the bone cuts and the evidence of attempted healing suggests that the perpetrator had significant medical knowledge and was using these children to practice surgical procedures. This revelation cast new suspicion on Dr. Nathaniel Garrison himself, as he was one of the few people in the region with the medical knowledge necessary to conduct such experiments. However, Garrison's own journals and the testimony of numerous patients eliminated him as a suspect, while his genuine horror at the discoveries seemed to rule out his involvement. The investigation revealed that Eleanor Blackwood had maintained extensive correspondence with medical professionals, charitable organizations, and government officials throughout the region. Her letters, discovered during a search of the homestead, demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of medical procedures, psychological treatment methods, and legal regulations governing child welfare. Mrs. Blackwood's correspondence reveals a level of medical and legal knowledge that far exceeds what one would expect from a frontier woman regardless of her charitable work, Deputy Garrison reported to Sheriff Whitfield. She writes knowledgeably about anatomical procedures, psychological treatment methods, and legal precedents regarding child custody and welfare. This education had to come from somewhere. Further investigation revealed that Eleanor Blackwood had not been the simple frontier widow she claimed to be. County records from Kentucky, obtained through territorial government channels, showed that she had been married to Marcus Blackwood, a physician who had operated a private hospital for mentally disturbed patients before his death in Missouri. Eleanor had served as her husband's assistant and had received extensive training in medical procedures and patient care. This background information suggested that Eleanor possessed both the medical knowledge and the experience with controlling vulnerable populations necessary
to conduct the experiments evidenced by the remains. Her work with her husband's mental patients had apparently provided her with understanding of psychological manipulation techniques and physical restraint techniques that she had adapted for use with children. The discovery of Eleanor's medical background led Sheriff Whitfield to re-examine her explanations for various aspects of the homestead's operations. Her claims about helping troubled children overcome trauma took on sinister implications when viewed in light of her knowledge of psychological manipulation techniques. Her reputation for never losing a child to illness became suspicious when considered alongside evidence of medical experimentation. Mrs. Blackwood has been presenting herself as a simple charitable woman, but her background suggests she had professional-level medical training and experience managing institutionalized patients, Sheriff Whitfield noted in his official report. This knowledge would have given her both the means and the opportunity to conduct the systematic abuse evidenced by the burial ground. Eleanor's response to the revelation of her medical background was to claim that she had been attempting to use her knowledge to help the children in her care overcome the trauma and health problems common to orphan frontier children. She insisted that her medical training had been a blessing that allowed her to provide better care than most families could offer. "My dear husband taught me many things about caring for people who have been damaged by life's cruelties," Eleanor explained to investigators. "I have always tried to use that knowledge to help these precious children heal from their losses and become productive members of society. If my medical background makes me seem suspicious, I understand your concerns, but I can only hope that my years of charitable work will speak to my true character." However, the combination of the burial ground evidence, Eleanor's concealed medical background, and the growing list of missing children who had been connected to her homestead created a pattern that Sheriff Whitfield could no longer ignore. The investigation was expanding beyond a simple examination of the burial ground to become a comprehensive review of Eleanor Blackwood's entire operation. The turning point in the investigation came when Dr. Garrison made a discovery that definitively linked Eleanor to the murders. Hidden in a locked chest in Eleanor's private quarters, investigators found a collection of detailed medical journals documenting experiments conducted on living children over a period of nearly 10 years. The journals revealed Eleanor Blackwood to be not the charitable saint she appeared, but rather a methodical killer who had been using orphan children as subjects for medical experimentation. The entries, written in Eleanor's careful handwriting, documented procedures that ranged from simple anatomical studies to complex surgical experiments conducted without anesthesia or proper medical care. Subject 7 responded poorly to surgical removal of appendix without chemical restraint, read one typical entry dated 1852. Subject maintained consciousness throughout procedure and displayed significant vocal distress. Death occurred approximately 6 hours post-procedure, likely due to shock and blood loss. Future experiments should utilize stronger physical restraints and consider chemical sedation methods.
The journals contained detailed observations about the children's responses to various forms of physical and psychological torture, systematic documentation of their deaths, and careful notes about disposal methods and burial procedures. Eleanor had been conducting what amounted to a private medical school, using orphan children as involuntary test subjects, with death being the predictable outcome of her experiments. Sheriff Whitfield realized that Eleanor Blackwood represented something unprecedented in Missouri Territory criminal history, a serial killer who had used society's blind spots regarding charitable work to conduct systematic murder over nearly a decade. The revelation would challenge everything the community thought it knew about the nature of evil and the reliability of public reputation as a measure of private character. The discovery of Eleanor Blackwood's medical journals on January 8, 1857, marked the end of her decade-long masquerade as a charitable saint.
Sheriff Cornelius Whitfield found himself facing something unprecedented in Missouri Territory law enforcement, a woman who had systematically murdered 23 children while maintaining the respect and admiration of an entire community. The confrontation came at dawn on January 10th, when Whitfield arrived at the Blackwood homestead with federal marshals and a warrant for Eleanor's arrest. What he found challenged every assumption about how a caught killer might react to exposure. Eleanor Blackwood stood in her kitchen, calmly preparing breakfast for the 15 children still in her care, as if the previous weeks of investigation had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. When Whitfield read the charges against her, 23 counts of murder in the first degree, Eleanor listened with the same composed attention she might give to a weather report. "Sheriff Whitfield," Eleanor said when he finished reading, "I assume you'll be taking the children into protective custody. I've prepared individual bundles of their belongings and medical histories. Most of them will require careful placement, as they've become quite dependent on the structure I've provided." The chilling normalcy of Eleanor's response revealed the depth of her psychological detachment from her crimes. She spoke about the murdered children as failed experiments, the surviving children as successful projects, and her own arrest as an unfortunate interruption of important work. During her interrogation, Eleanor displayed no remorse, denial, or emotional distress. Instead, she methodically explained her methodology with the clinical precision of a medical professor discussing research techniques. The children had been necessary subjects for advancing understanding of human anatomy and psychological development, she claimed. Their deaths had contributed valuable knowledge that would benefit future medical science. "These children were already damaged goods, Sheriff," Eleanor explained matter-of-factly. "Orphans with no families, no prospects, no value to society beyond what I could make of them. I gave their lives meaning by using them to advance medical knowledge. Many of them lived longer under my care than they would have on the streets or in other institutions." Eleanor's adult children, Martha, Benjamin, and Sarah, were arrested as accomplices, but their interrogations revealed the extent to which they had been psychologically manipulated from childhood. Raised to view Eleanor's activities as normal and necessary, they had participated in the torture and murder of other children while believing they were assisting in important medical research. The legal proceedings that followed Eleanor's arrest became a sensation throughout Missouri Territory and beyond. Newspapers in St. Louis, Kansas City, and even Chicago covered the trial extensively, with Eleanor Blackwood becoming one of the first female serial killers to receive national attention. The trial revealed the sophisticated system Eleanor had developed for selecting, acquiring, and disposing of her victims. County prosecutors demonstrated that she had deliberately targeted children with minimal family connections, used her reputation for charitable work to avoid scrutiny, and maintained detailed records that proved premeditation and systematic planning. Eleanor's defense attorney attempted to argue that her medical background and charitable reputation demonstrated mental instability rather than criminal intent. However, the prosecution's presentation of her detailed experimental journals, combined with testimony from surviving children who described systematic torture, made it impossible to claim insanity. On March 15, 1857, Eleanor Blackwood was sentenced to death by hanging, becoming the first woman in Missouri Territory history to receive capital punishment for serial murder. Her execution, carried out on April 22, 1857, drew crowds of spectators from across the region who came to witness the end of one of the most notorious criminals in American frontier history. The surviving children from the Blackwood homestead faced challenging futures. Many had been so thoroughly conditioned by Eleanor's psychological manipulation that they struggled to adapt to normal family life. Several required extended institutional care to overcome the trauma of their experiences, while others disappeared into the anonymous masses of frontier society, their fates unknown.
Dr. Nathaniel Garrison spent the remainder of his career studying the case, attempting to understand how someone like Eleanor Blackwood could develop and maintain such systematic cruelty while presenting a facade of charitable virtue.
The Blackwood homestead was abandoned immediately after Eleanor's arrest, with local residents avoiding the property due to its association with the murders. The buildings gradually deteriorated, and by 1870, nothing remained but stone foundations and the sealed burial ground where 23 children had been laid to rest. Sheriff Whitfield's investigation reports, preserved in Missouri State Archives, documented not just the crimes themselves, but the social conditions that had allowed them to continue undetected. The case led to significant reforms in child welfare oversight and established new protocols for monitoring charitable institutions throughout the territory. The legacy of Eleanor Blackwood extends far beyond her individual crimes. Her case demonstrated how society's assumptions about gender, charity, and respectability could provide perfect cover for systematic evil. The investigation revealed that communities' trust in charitable organizations and respected figures could become dangerous blind spots that predators could exploit for years without detection. Modern criminal psychologists who have studied the Blackwood case note its significance as one of the earliest documented examples of institutional serial killing in American history. Eleanor's methods, using legitimate charitable work as cover for systematic murder, would be replicated by other killers throughout American history, making her case study material for understanding how predators exploit social trust. The children's burial ground beneath the barn was eventually relocated to the Joplin Municipal Cemetery, where a simple marker reads 23 unknown children, 1847 to 1856, remembered. The memorial serves as a reminder that evil can wear the mask of virtue and that society's most vulnerable members require protection not just from obvious threats, but from those who claim to be their guardians. Eleanor Blackwood's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil and the reliability of public reputation as a measure of private character. Her decade-long success in maintaining a facade of charitable sainthood while conducting systematic murder demonstrates that our assumptions about who can be trusted with vulnerable populations may be dangerously naive. What do you think about this chilling case from Missouri's frontier history? Do you believe there could be modern-day Eleanor Blackwoods operating under the cover of charitable work? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. Remember, the truth is often more terrifying than fiction, and history's shadows hold secrets that continue to challenge our understanding of human nature.